Hello, my name is Tayo Afawape, and I am the Director of Administration and Compliance with the Community Development Administration. I am also here with Justin Jackson, who is our Executive Director. Thank you for joining today's eligibility requirements and best practices capacity building trainings. These last trainings are two of many conducted this week, as highlighted on the schedule. To recap, on Monday, we provided an overview of the non-housing RFP and an introduction to Egrants, which is our online grant management system, where applicants submit and track their proposals. The RFP went live Tuesday on Egrants, and a PDF version of the RFP is accessible on our website. On Wednesday, we covered organizational requirements that discuss the programmatic aspects of Cdbg funding, while Thursday, we covered the financial aspects. We will conclude the capacity training series with our eligibility requirements and best practices for the RFP presentations. All training materials can be found on the CDA website. We will post each workshop online immediately following its completion. We encourage you to periodically check this website for news and updates. Designing Cdbg eligible programs. This presentation will briefly cover Cdbg's background and explain how national objectives and eligible activities are the two cornerstones in designing Cdbg eligible programs. For the sake of time, I will not review every slide. Most of the slides I am skipping are helpful exercises and examples to gauge your understanding of the materials. I strongly recommend that you review these slides at your leisure. I will discuss the background of the Community Development Block Grant Program. The Cdbg program was enacted as part of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 and is administered by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. As one of the longest running HUD programs, the Cdbg program provides annual grants on a formula basis to over 1,200 municipalities, such as the City of St. Louis, and other units of government around the country to develop viable urban communities. As an entitlement community under the Cdbg program, the City of St. Louis receives an annual allocation to meet the goals of the Cdbg program, which are providing decent, affordable housing, providing a suitable living environment, and expanding economic opportunities primarily for low and moderate income persons. Note that throughout this presentation, I will refer to low and moderate income persons as LMI or low mod persons. All of these terms are synonymous. There are 4 steps in designing a Cdbg eligible program. First is identifying an idea or concept. Next, determine if that idea or concept meets a national objective and is an eligible activity under Cdbg regulations. And lastly, determine the cost reasonableness of the program following the principles as detailed in 2 CFR Part 200, as discussed yesterday in our financial management presentation. This is important. For an activity to qualify under Cdbg, it must meet a Cdbg program goals that I just covered. The activity must also meet a national objective and be an eligible activity under Cdbg regulations. I will now go more into depth about these last 2 items, starting with Cdbg national objectives. Regulations concerning the Cdbg national objectives can be found on 24 CFR Part 570.208. Determining if your idea or concept meets a Cdbg national objective is the second step in designing a Cdbg eligible program. There are 3 national objectives. The first one is the prevention or elimination of slums and blight. The second pertains to activities that address an urgent threat to health or welfare. And the third pertains to activities that primarily benefit low and moderate income persons. If an activity does not fall into at least one of these 3 national objectives, the activity is ineligible for Cdbg funding. Elimination of slum and blight is not commonly used as a national objective. It must include activities designated to address the deteriorated physical environment. There are 3 subcategories of elimination of slums and blight. The first is Slum Blight Area Basis, or SBA. This is where you eliminate slums or blight in a designated area. The service area must be defined and meet the definition of slum blight under state or local law, typically through an ordinance. And you must document that a substantial number of buildings within the service area, at least 25% or more, have visible signs of deterioration, or the area's public improvements within the service area are all generally in a state of deterioration. The second subcategory is Slum Blight Spot Basis, or SBS. This is where you eliminate specific conditions of blight or physical decay on a spot basis and is not located in a slum or blighted area. Rehabilitation is limited to the extent necessary to eliminate a specific condition that is detrimental to public health and safety. The third subcategory is Slum Blight Urban Renewal Area, or SBR. This is where you eliminate slum or blight as part of an urban renewal plan. This type of elimination of slum and blight is not applicable under this RFP. Note that the area must be blighted prior to applying for funding. Urgent need is another national objective. It is used in emergency situations to meet a serious and immediate threat to the health and welfare of the community. The threat must be recent or recently became urgent, generally within 18 months preceding the agency certification. COVID-related activities may address an emergency situation, but it may not necessarily fit under this national objective for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, the emergency declaration for COVID-19 occurred over 18 months ago. Secondly, to qualify under urgent need, the organization must avoid what is called duplication of services. Avoiding duplication of services means that the proposed activity must be the option of last resort, and there must be no other funding sources available to carry out that activity. That is a tall order, given that there are many stimulus monies to address COVID-related issues. Thirdly, at least 70% of CDA's total Cdbg expenditures must benefit low-mod persons. Because the proposed activity is not based upon a person's income, but rather upon a situation at large, the activity would count against the 70% threshold, making it difficult for us to fulfill our federal obligation in serving primarily low-mod persons. For these reasons stated, the urgent need national objective is not applicable to this RFP. If your activity is COVID-related, your activity would more likely fit under another national objective, which is called activities that benefit low-mod persons. Activities benefiting low-mod persons is the most important and most common national objective. As I mentioned before, even HUD statute requires that most expenditures, 70% of them, must benefit low-mod persons. Under this national objective, records must document the low-mod status of each participant. Who are considered LMI persons? LMI persons must have income that cannot exceed 80% of the current area median income, or AMI, based upon that person's family or household size. A single person is considered a person family, a one-person family or household under this definition. This table represents the 2022 income limits for City of St. Louis residents participating in a Cdbg program. As indicated on the left-hand column, HUD requires us to track income that is considered extremely low or under 30% AMI, income that is considered low income or between 30 and 50% AMI, and income that is considered moderate or between 50 and 80% AMI. Up top, the table is numbered 1 through 8, representing the number of people in a family or household. So based on this table, in order for a family or household size of 4 to qualify for a program, their gross annual income cannot exceed $75,900. Note, I have been differentiating income based upon family or household size. This is important that you have a clear understanding of the differences between a family and household because it affects how participants are eligible for the activity. A family under Cdbg regulations is defined as all persons living in the same household who are related by blood, marriage, or adoption. So 2 people who are friends with each other living under the same household are each considered to be a one-person family under this definition. Adult children 18 years and older who continue to live at home with their parents are considered to be part of the family and their income must be counted. A dependent child living outside of the home, such as students living in a dormitory or other student living, is considered to be part of the family even though that person is living elsewhere. Cdbg differentiates between household and family. It is therefore important that your procedures, forms, and so on utilize the correct definition. Public service programs and almost all non-housing activities typically use family, while anything housing related typically uses household. The key difference between a household and a family is that a household consists of everyone living in the same housing unit, regardless of whether or not they are related to each other. If this concept is still not clear, I would strongly recommend going through the next couple of slides, which provide examples to help you differentiate between a family and a household. When applying for Cdbg funding, if you are applying for a public service, public improvement, or any other non-housing related activity, person served would be based upon a family size. However, any persons assisted under housing activities, such as minor home repair or first-time home buyer services, that would be based upon household size. There are 4 ways activities can meet the low and moderate income national objective. They are activities that serve a limited clientele, also known as low mod clientele or LMC, are based upon area benefit, also known as low mod area or LMA, involve employment, also known as low mod jobs or LMJ, or involve housing, also known as LMH or low mod housing. Activities that serve a limited clientele or LMC can qualify based on nature and location, presumed benefit, or family size and income. CDA requires that all limited clientele programs utilize intake forms to determine eligibility. Qualifying as nature and location is not very common and must be approved by CDA in advance. An example of qualifying under nature and location would be a daycare center that is located in a public housing development that exclusively serves public housing residents. In this situation, it can be automatically assumed that given the nature and location of the activity only serves low to moderate income persons. A more common limited clientele subcategory are activities that are presumed to benefit low to moderate income persons. Through rigorous data collection, HUD has determined that certain populations are highly likely and therefore are presumed to be low to moderate income. To have presumption status, your activity must exclusively serve one or more of the following presumed groups: the elderly, meaning persons who are 62 years of age and older, severely disabled adults, abused children, battered spouses, homeless persons, illiterate adults, persons with AIDS, and migrant farm workers. A classic example of a program that would qualify under presumed benefit is a senior Meals on Wheels program. Another example is a domestic shelter that exclusively houses abused children and battered spouses. Qualifying under family and income is the most common national objective for most public service activities. These activities include, but are not limited to, daycare centers, youth services for after-school programs ages 6 to 18, summer programming for at-risk youth, job readiness training for ex-offenders, food pantry, and low-income tax assistance. Agencies must have documentation that at least 51% of all participants are low to moderate income residing in the city of St. Louis. If by the end of the contract year, the percent of LMI people served are less, or I would say the percent of LMI people living in the city served are less than 51%, then the agency must repay Cdbg funds. Moreover, if you fail to document the LMI status of the participants, you would also have to repay funds. Low Mod Income Area Benefit, or LMA, is a second subcategory that assists persons who are low to moderate income. Low Moderate Income Area Benefit, or LMA activities must have the following. Boundaries must be clearly defined via census tracts, neighborhoods, or zip codes. At least 51% of the service area must consist of LMI city residents. You typically use census data to make this determination. Note that in the proposal that if your service area is not citywide, then you would need to be able to identify your service area both by census tract and neighborhood or zip code. The main reason is because HUD looks at service areas by census tracts, but the general public identifies areas by zip codes or neighborhoods. Number 3, the service area must be primarily residential. You can determine this by using Geo St. Louis. The website is on the slide. Activities must benefit all residents in the service area, and the service area must be reasonably defined. For example, do not define your service area by wards to avoid any political connotations in your application. Since funding can assist city residents, defining your service area exclusively outside of the city limits is another example of an ill-defined service area. Low Mod Income Jobs, or LMJ, is the third subcategory that assists persons who are low to moderate income. In order to meet this criteria, activities must create or retain permanent jobs and 51% of the jobs created or retained must be available to or held by LMI persons. Please note that jobs counted are based on a full-time equivalent basis, or FTE, which is the same as working 40 hours per week. For every one FTE permanent job created or retained, $35,000 of Cdbg funds must be used. For example, if you are awarded $75,000 in Cdbg funding, your agency must create or retain 3 FTE jobs. Failure to satisfy job requirements will result in payback of Cdbg funding. I should also note that employment services that provide job readiness training and workshops will not fit under this national objective. Instead, it would go under limited clientele, where the requirements are less rigorous. Low-mod income housing, or LMH, is the 4th subcategory that assists persons who are low to moderate income. This is the only low-mod national objective for housing activities. To meet the housing national objective, structures must be occupied by low-mod income households. Remember, we made this distinction earlier between a family and a household. Family counts all blood relatives in a unit, while household counts everyone in a unit regardless of relationships. Typical housing activities include homeowner rehabilitation, rental acquisition and rehab, and home buyer assistance programs. Here is a summary of the Cdbg national objectives. I covered Slums and Blight, a national objective to address a physically distressed area that is typically blighted through an ordinance or a blighted study. Urgent need, a national objective to address emergency situations that has to document that the Cdbg funding is an option of last resort. Note that this national objective is not applicable under this RFP. I also covered the national objectives that are related to serving low to moderate income individuals, which are LMA activities that service an area that is primarily residential and primarily low to moderate income. LMJ activities that require the creation or retention of jobs for low-mod persons. LMH activities that are strictly for housing-related activities, targeting low-mod homeowners, first-time home buyers, or renters. I also covered the 3 ways to meet the LMC national objective. They are nature and location, in which the nature and location clearly illustrates that the activity will primarily target LMI persons. Presumed benefit, in which persons served are presumed to be LMI persons. And the most common method of meeting a national objective is by family size and income, where you must document that at least 51% of all city participants are low to moderate income. Next, I will go over Cdbg eligible activities from the Regulations 24 CFR Part 570.201. This is the 3rd step in designing a Cdbg eligible program. Cdbg funds can only be used for activities that fall under a matrix code or authorized category of basic eligibility. In other words, for every eligible activity, there must be a matrix code. We report on a variety of things in HUD's database that is called the Integrated Disbursement Information System, or IDIS. One thing we must enter into IDIS is a matrix code that is affiliated with the eligible activity. Questions populated by IDIS are based upon which matrix code is selected. Therefore, activities must be properly classified so that the correct matrix code is entered. Adequate documentation must be provided and maintained for the selected activity so that we can accurately report program outcomes into IDIS. The RFP lists all eligible activities available to prospective applicants, which is based upon the most recent consolidated plan. To qualify for Cdbg funding, programs must meet a national objective and be an eligible activity. Examples of eligible activities include, but are not limited to, acquisition of real property, clearance and demolition, rehabilitation of housing, construction of public facilities, microenterprise assistance, public improvements such as streets and sidewalks, public services, economic development, home ownership, and planning and capacity building. Regulations expressly prohibit the following activities: buildings for conduct of government, such as city hall improvements. Exceptions are community centers. General government expenses, such as trash pickup and operating the city's tax collection department. And political activities, such as costs related to political campaigns and get out the vote drives. The most common eligible activity is public services. Under this activity, Cdbg funds may be used to provide public services, including labor, supplies, materials, and other costs, provided that each of the following criteria is met. First, the public service must either be a new service or a quantifiable increase in the level of a service, and the total amount of allocated public service funding cannot exceed the city's public service cap. Regulations state that the public service cap is 15%. CDA, however, is grandfathered in at 19%. Public service activities include, but are not limited to, energy conservation counseling and testing, childcare, healthcare, job training, recreation programs, education programs, public safety services, services for seniors, drug abuse counseling and treatment, and services for homeless persons. Now, I'm going to skip the next slide that provides a more in-depth analysis of public service activities that you can review later. Under public facility and improvement categories, Cdbg funds may be used by the grantee or nonprofits for the acquisition, construction, rehabilitation, reconstruction, or the installation of public improvements or facilities, except for buildings used for general conduct of government. Facilities must be open to the general public, and the improvements and facilities must be publicly owned or owned by the nonprofit. As mentioned in previous presentations, if you're interested in applying for public facilities and improvements, also known as construction activities, please view the presentation on organizational requirements, which have been posted onto the CDA website. I'm skipping these next slides that provide analysis about public facilities and improvements to be viewed at your leisure. I would like to focus on tips in determining eligible activities. First tip is to refer to the list of priorities on the RFP to determine viable activity options. Also use HUD's comprehensive list and descriptions of eligible activities. So let me see if I can open this up. Oh, it looks like I can't show you the example, but I'm not able to click on those links. But these last two PowerPoints, I would definitely recommend to look at those to help you determine if your activity is in that, meets a national objective and is also an eligible activity. And I'm going to skip these questions. They're just gauging your understanding of the materials. And so that would conclude my presentation. Let me see if there are any questions. Okay, so I have an Egrants question, which is, how do I obtain a username and password for Egrants? So you first have to make sure that your agency is registered with Egrants. After you make that determination, then you would be able to create your username as well as your password. And then there are also slides for Egrants, and I actually have those at the end of this second presentation. I do reference that information, so that will also better answer your question. And then another question I have is, what is the total amount of money for this funding? Is there a maximum suggested for this proposal? There is not a maximum. We just ask that your request is reasonable based upon any leverage funding that you have, and also given the activity that there's no wasteful spending or anything of that matter. So another question is it correct that only 19% of this funding is available for public services? So proposals for construction and other projects would more likely be funded. That may or may not be the case. Public service activities tend to be less expensive than construction projects. So we actually can fund quite a bit of public service activities, more than you think. And actually, it typically is our bread and butter. We have most of our contracts are through it with public services. Another question is, what is the total amount of Cdbg funding for this RFP? And I think Justin would be able to better answer this than I would if he's available. If not, I don't believe there is the total amount. I could say, this is what I can say historically. I would say historically it's been around 20 million, but that can change from year to year. Yeah. Okay, so it looks like I have answered all questions. And I will continue on with our second presentation. So this is the Cdbg Proposal Best Practices Workshop. There are 3 parts to this presentation. I'll start with the common RFP. I'll start with common RFP mistakes so that, excuse me. I'll start with the common RFP mistakes that we see on an annual basis that you should avoid. The second part will review the sections of the RFP in depth. Lastly, I'll allocate time for Q&A. The 10 common Cdbg RFP mistakes are as follows. The first one is not following instructions. I've seen instances where agencies seem to cut and paste from what I call stock narratives, which are go-to narratives agencies already have about themselves. They then use these stock narratives to try to make it fit into the question without any adjustments. This is not a successful approach because the stock narrative may not respond to what is asked for, nor may it answer the question in full. So if the question asks about A, B, and C, don't only respond to C. Another mistake is making assumptions. Don't assume that CDA knows your organization. Provide sufficient detail so that someone who has never heard about your organization understands your background and experience, as well as your intent and goals behind the proposed activity. Also, the framework for your proposal should already be in place. Although there is some leeway for reasonable assumptions, those assumptions should be made explicit. We don't want agencies to have pie-in-the-sky proposals that cannot be feasibly accomplished. We want applications that accurately represent what your agency can do and, with reasonable assumptions, will do. Not reviewing your proposal prior to submission is another mistake. In the Egrants presentation, I reviewed how Egrants validates your entire proposal prior to submission. The Egrants validation process ensures that certain numerical data is consistent and certain items are completed. However, Egrants does not check for narrative consistency within your overall proposal. Narrative inconsistency confuses raters and obscures the organization's intentions and goals. That is why prior to submission, you should have someone who is familiar with all aspects of the proposed activity review the application. This person may not necessarily be the grant writer, who is usually assigned the project director role in Egrants. If the grant writer has no involvement with the day-to-day activities of the proposed program, we recommend that the final reviewer should be your executive director or the actual project director of the proposed program. Whoever is the final reviewer, that person should make sure that the proposal makes sense as a whole, as well as be knowledgeable about all aspects of the application in the event there are questions about it. The fourth mistake is not fully demonstrating community need for the project. Your activity must demonstrate that it is principally serving low and moderate income persons, and you should back up your claim with data, whether it be reliable qualitative or quantitative data collected in-house or from other reliable sources. It is your responsibility to articulate how the activity is needed. And as said before, don't make any assumptions about what the reader may or may not know. Number 5 is not fully explaining your program design. The framework or program design should already be conceived at this point. The framework should not only be fully explained, but also be realistic. The reader should be able to make sense of your program design. Another mistake is that your activity does not meet a national objective and/or is not eligible. This mistake is the costliest of them all, for your activity is ineligible and cannot meet a national objective. No matter how good your proposal is, CDA cannot fund it. It is important to review the RFP to ensure that your project meets these parameters. Lack of realistic outputs and objectives is another mistake. Your outputs and objectives should be consistent with your program design. Not making a reasonable ask is another mistake. What would a prudent person think? That is one important takeaway from the financial requirement presentation. CDA looks to see if costs of the proposed activity are reasonable and realistic. It is possible that you may come in too low. There is a minimum ask from CDA of $25,000. So if you don't need up to that threshold, then Cdbg funding is not for you. On the opposite side of the spectrum, your ask may be too high. Successful applications also leverage funds. Cdbg typically should not be your sole source of funding. There should not be superfluous spending or funding not applicable to the proposed activity. Make sure you are requesting sufficient amount of resources to carry out the project. Not taking advantage of bonus points is mistake number 9. Your service area and your activity, if your service area and your activity is in a approved or a proposed NARSA, make sure that you make that explicit. I've seen instances where the service area may be citywide, but because the proposal doesn't explicitly indicate that it's in a NARSA, they lose out on bonus points. The last common mistake is not using all of the space provided. The space provided for narrative or explanation indicates how long a response should typically be. We don't expect the application to be 5 pages, nor should it be 500 pages. Also, never leave a space blank. If a question does not apply to your organization, state why, so the reader is not left to assume. Now I will review sections of the RFP. As mentioned before, the biggest mistake to avoid is for your proposed activity to not be eligible or meet a national objective. Review the Cdbg background and national objective section to determine if your activity meets a national objective. If your activity does not meet a national objective, it cannot be funded. It is critical that you review the priorities and eligible activities section. This section identifies the funding priorities for the City of St. Louis, which was discussed in depth during our funding priorities presentation. If the proposed activity is not an eligible activity and is not listed as a priority, then CDA cannot fund it. In the RFP, there are a set of instructions that are important to review. We recommend using this instruction sheet as a checklist because it identifies conditions that will disqualify applicants, such as being federally debarred or not having CBI clearance. This page also provides instructions on submitting questions and important deadlines. The Cdbg RFP is due on August 26 at 4 p.m. Questions about RFP content and process must be sent to cdbg@stlewis-mo.gov no later than August 12th at 4 p.m. CDA will post the answers to these questions under frequently asked questions and answers onto the CDA website. You may also have questions about how to maneuver egrams. I would first suggest reviewing the egram slides and video on the CDA website. I will reference this at the end of the presentation. If those materials do not sufficiently answer your question, then email them to egramsupport@stlewis-mo.gov no later than August 26 at 12 p.m. The application must be signed by an authorized signer for the organization who is typically the executive director, a board president, or other designated person who has been cleared by your board. Likely, this would be the same person who is the final reviewer of the application. A common mistake is that the UEI number and SAM.gov issues are not resolved prior to submitting the proposal. So start registration and updating your profile in SAM.gov early. If already enrolled, periodically search your organization on SAM.gov through the public domain to verify that your registration is not close to expiring. Be proactive and update your registration if it will expire in the next several months. SAM.gov has undergone many facelifts during the past couple of years, ranging from platform changes to replacing the DUNS number with the UEI number. For those who are familiar with the new platforms, SAM.gov will walk you through these changes. Here is a slide of what SAM.gov looks like when you first enter into its website as of last month. The first organizational narrative you will provide will be about the organization's background. This narrative showcases your organizational capacity to administer the proposed activity. This section can significantly affect the organization's overall rating in Egrams. In Egrams, there is a sample rating sheet in the Show Document hyperlink that will be used to determine successful applications. I recommend reviewing the rating sheet so that your organization is aware of what they will be judged on. Note that responses to this section impact the agency program and financial qualifications category on the rating sheet. A common mistake is providing too much or not enough detail. Like Goldilocks, find the narrative that is just right. Don't provide an overly detailed timeline of your agency's history, while on the other extreme, don't be vague and state, for instance, you provide a variety of services to people in the neighborhood. In short, ensure you provide sufficient detail so that someone outside of your organization has a good understanding of what your organization does. Another tip is that your proposed activity should be consistent with your mission. For example, a child care center requesting funding for an offender reentry program seems out of line without adequately explaining the deviation in purpose and change in type of service. Applicants must attach all required licenses, including a City of St. Louis business license or proof of exemption. If you are a nonprofit, you may be exempt from obtaining this license and would need to call the business license office to obtain an exemption notice. Whether or not your organization has a business license or is exempt, please attach proof. Your organization may also need other types of licensing. For a daycare, for example, you would need to attach the organization's daycare license. A letter of recommendation from a previous funder is recommended for organizations not funded by CDA. It is also optional for organizations currently funded by CDA. A letter of recommendation from a previous funder helps CDA determine to what extent has the agency successfully handled funding. Please do not provide an aldermanic support letter as it does not address this question. In the personnel description and resume section of the proposal, upload both the resume and job descriptions of all proposed staff positions for the proposed activity. If the position is a to be hired or a TBH position, then upload only the job description. If your agency is funded, once your agency is ready to hire for that position, the agency must follow CDA's Equal Employment Opportunity or EEO requirements. Furthermore, you must obtain CDA approval for the staffing costs to be Cdbg eligible. As you can see, there tend to be a lot of issues with this section, which I will detail. Please submit both the job description and resumes when required. Include all staff involved in the proposed Cdbg activities, whether or not they will be paid with Cdbg funding. Agencies usually remember the programmatic staff affiliated with the Cdbg activity, but tend to forget the staff with fiscal and procurement responsibilities, such as the CFO. If you have subcontractors, do not add them to the personnel description. Instead, add them to the proposed Cdbg activity budget section of the proposal under the line item Contractual and Professional Services. Any to-be-hireds on your personnel list must follow CDA's Equal Employment Opportunity requirements, even during the limbo stage where you are awarded funding but not yet under contract. Failure to do so will result in CDA not paying the salaries or benefits of that new hire. EEO requirements are stated on proposal as such. The position must be posted in a general circulation and minority paper with the St. Louis Agency on Training and Employment or SLATE and on the agency's website. Alternative methods of announcing job vacancies must be approved in writing by the Executive Director of CDA prior to utilizing the alternative medium. Note that in Egrants, the staff information you input in the personnel description and resume section will carry over to the personnel schedule that is located in a different section of the application. Under the Financial Management section, upload a copy of your most recent IRS Form 990. If it is not current, then upload the approved extension. It may also be the case that the agency failed to obtain an approved extension. Being cognizant of when the 990 is due and planning accordingly is one way to prevent this from happening. The 990 is due to the IRS on the 5th month following the end of the organization's taxable year. Therefore, if your organization's fiscal calendar ends June 30th, then the 990 is due November 15th. However, if your organization's fiscal calendar ends December 31st, then the 990 is due May 15th. Common mistakes are having an approved extension but not attaching it. Another mistake is not to include the financial staff such as accountants, CFO, etc., into the personnel description and resume section of the application. Here are some tips you can utilize in your financial management organization narratives. Ensure that your responses demonstrate your organization's financial management systems and internal controls. Questions in this section are very specific and multi-layered. This section is definitely an instance where agencies are often vague or provide incomplete answers. Remember that if a question asks for A, B, and C, provide A, B, and C. Answers to these questions can significantly affect your rating under agency financial requirements. Agency financial qualifications rating category. Along with not providing sufficient detail and supporting sufficient segregation of major accounting functions, another common mistake is not providing sufficient detail on your board of directors oversight regarding organizational financial matters. Organizations expending more than $750,000 in federal funding must have proof of a single federal audit. Federal funds include federally sourced funds passing through a state or local government. If your organization's threshold exceeds $750,000 in federal expenditures within your fiscal year audit, reports must be filed with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse 9 months after the organization's fiscal year end date. Furthermore, if this single federal audit is required, tell us how your organization will comply with it. Responses to this question demonstrates the organization's familiarity with the single federal audit process as stated in 2 CFR Part 200, Subpart F. Not demonstrating sufficient knowledge of this regulation as it relates to budgeting the cost of an audit, procurement, and selection of an audit firm, and timely submission of the audit report is a common mistake. In the event there are any findings associated with your most recent audit, whether it be a single audit or any other audit, please provide the current status of the findings. The most common mistake is being too vague in your response. Provide sufficient detail regarding the deficiency or concern by including a brief description of each finding and question costs, if applicable, as well as the steps taken to resolve the issues and the current status of the finding. Note, however, if your organization has any unresolved or open HUD audit or monitoring findings, the application will be disqualified and deemed ineligible for funding. Furthermore, any outstanding payments owed on debt to CDA or payments past due to CDA as a result of monitoring or audit findings will also result in the rejection of the application. Your annual and proposed operating budgets are where you enter all funding sources and expenses for the entire agency by the line item descriptions on the form. This information helps CDA see the organization's financial management in a very broad way by identifying where your funding sources come from, where they're being applied, and your revenue and expense ratios. A common mistake is not entering the start and end dates of your organization's fiscal year. Cdbg funding follows a 12-month funding cycle from January till December 31st. And so if your organization follows a fiscal calendar year ending June 30th, be mindful that your organization may need to make some adjustments to accommodate funding that follows a different calendar year. So previous sections of the application were about your organization as a whole. These next sections get into the specifics of your proposed activities. Organizations must submit separate proposals for each separate and distinct proposed activity. This statement is critical. A proposal that combines multiple proposed activities can be outrightly rejected. Here are some examples to help you determine if your proposal should be one or many. An organization would like to request funding for an after-school program or after-school programs at 3 locations. In this situation, the activity is the same but being carried out in different places. Therefore, the agency can submit 3 separate proposals or submit 1 proposal inclusive of all of the sites. Another organization would like to request funding for an after-school arts program and a daycare center. In this example, the after-school program and the daycare center are public services serving youth. However, these activities are distinct because each provide a different kind of programming. They both actually have 2 separate matrix codes. As such, the organizations must submit 2 separate proposals. Organization HIJ would like to request funding to rehab several of their rooms and provide a food pantry in the same building. In this example, there are 2 distinct activities, one under public facilities and improvements, and the other is food assistance under public services. This organization must submit 2 separate proposals. A tip for the activity cover sheet is to only check 1 priority and 1 eligible activity. If your activity does not fit into a priority, that is not eligible. I know I will stop repeating that. A common mistake in this section is that the contact person is not the primary contact person for the proposed activity. The person listed should be the person who is involved in the day-to-day programmatic administration of the proposed program. Do not put your grant writer as a primary contact if that person does not meet those conditions. The Cdbg amount requested for your proposal should be realistic and reasonable and should consider any leverage sources that you anticipate receiving. Given the rigorous compliance obligations your agency must adhere to, should it be funded, CDA has set the minimum Cdbg ask for $25,000. If in reviewing your budget for the proposed activity, you deem this amount to be too much, then this is not the right funding source for you. We have spoken about responses not being too vague. As such, your activity name and summary should be succinct yet descriptive. For example, naming the activity XYZ After School Program or ABC Financial Literacy Program helps the reader understand the general purpose of the program and who is administering the program. Your agency's mission statement should be consistent with the activity summary. However, organizations usually have to create a summary for the activity that is different from its mission statement so that it meets certain conditions. More specifically, the summary should be less than 100 words. It should include the activity name, its purpose, where the services will be provided, the target geographic areas and populations, and the number of people served. Some of these criteria will be explained more in depth in upcoming slides. Here are some tips concerning your activity name and summary. Your activity name and summary, or really anywhere within the proposal, must not include political or religious references. CDBG funds cannot support inherent political endeavors such as get out the vote campaigns or religious activities such as worship or religious instruction. Agencies may want to highlight that their activity is limited to a specific area in the project, which is fine, but I would strongly suggest not to reference the area by ward, but instead by neighborhoods or other non-political delineations. Be mindful that if funded, the activity name and summary will carry over into your contract. So don't name your proposal CDBG application because it sounds odd as the name of your contract with CDA. The name of your proposal becomes important should your agency have multiple proposals. The name of each proposal should be uniquely identifiable in the event that both are awarded funding. Common mistakes are that the activity summary does not adequately summarize the activity, or the activity name has political or religious references or other language inappropriate for a contract name. Another mistake is not including all addresses and locations for the proposed activities. Understandably, there are situations where the locations may not be completely identified. This is common, for instance, for housing-related activities where you do not know yet where the job sites for the home repairs will be. In this circumstance, stating that the actual sites will be determined based upon eligibility is reasonable. However, there are circumstances where you need to be more specific as it relates to services being provided at one or more multiple locations. Stating that there will be multiple sites scattered throughout the city is too vague in this instance. Instead, indicate the address of a service area or description of the area. A description of the area may be applicable if you are providing a mobile service, such as driving a mammogram van within Lewis Place, for example. This is the section where you describe the work to be performed, services provided, and the population served. Clearly describe your program design by including the who, what, when, and how. The description provided here should be consistent with your outputs and criteria, which I will discuss in upcoming slides. If your program design is not fully explained or is inconsistent with other parts of your proposal, your score will be significantly reduced. Meeting a national objective. For this section, refer to the CDBG background of the RFP, as well as a presentation on designing CDBG eligible programs to determine which national objective your activity will be meeting. If funded, CDA will only reimburse for low to moderate income city residents participating in the activity. For example, if you have a job training program and you serve 200 people annually, but only 150 of them are city residents, CDA will only pay for those 150 people. Here's a tip if your activity is meeting an area benefit national objective. The number of beneficiaries is the number of low and moderate income individuals residing in the area. Another tip is to fully describe the service area in your proposal. If funded, be aware that CDA has to report to HUD service areas based on census tracts. However, the general public and the contracts generated with CDA usually describe the service area in terms of neighborhoods or zip codes. So unless your service area is citywide, descriptions of your service area should include both the census tracts as well as the neighborhoods or zip codes it incorporates. This is the section where you input your goals and outputs. Whoops, let me click on that. Allowable outputs are either persons, P, or households, HH. Housing-related activities such as home repair or home buyer assistance program would be selected as households. Otherwise, you would select persons. These outputs should be measurable and directly related to your activity for at least two reasons. The first reason is because reimbursements are based upon measurable outputs. CDA's payments to organizations are performance-based upon meeting quantifiable results. We do not provide advancements of funds, but rather reimburse an organization after they provided documentation that a measurable outcome has been achieved. The second reason why outputs should be measurable and directly related to your activity is because it helps you track quantifiable steps towards achieving your goals within your activity, which in turn provides CDA the tools to express your successes to HUD in measurable, quantifiable ways. Outputs are goal-specific and tied to your reimbursements. With that in mind, be prepared to propose and justify a per-unit cost based on your proposed outputs. During your goal-setting endeavor, be realistic in determining your outputs and figuring out if the per-unit cost per output is cost reasonable. I think an example will better explain what we mean here. Let's say an agency requests $200,000 for a summer program and proposes to serve 25 children for 3 months. In this situation, the cost per child is $8,000 or $200,000 divided by 25 children. The cost unit per child is, the per unit cost per child per month is $2,667 or $8,000 divided by 3 months. Ask yourself, are these costs reasonable? Because that is the question we will be asking. The following slides are specific to public improvement and facility activities. More information about construction requirements are on the organizational requirements presentation. Here are some site control tips. Control has to be documented in the name of the entity that is applying, whether that control is through a deed or a lease that indicates an allowance to build or rehab. So if the name on the deed or lease is under the name of an executive director, you would need to change it so that it is in the name of the organization. If the site is city-owned, the organization or the organization should have buy-in from the holding entity ASAP. If you have not reached out to the city holding entity about your project, it may be too late for you to apply for funding. CDA wants to see at least some constructive interactions with them regarding the project. Be sure to summarize those conversations you have had in the proposal. When creating your project schedule, be mindful that projects that are currently under construction or plan to begin construction earlier than June of 2023 are not eligible for CDBG funding. Here are some construction budget tips. Professionally prepare a construction budget using a professional construction estimator or pay a person who works for a general contractor to prepare a good bid. Do not take your project out to bid because it has to adhere to a strict sealed bid process pre-approved by CDA. Note that if funded, whoever prepares the construction budget cannot compete in the sealed bid process because they would have an unfair advantage. So select your budget preparer wisely. Procurement tips. If funded and you solicit a contractor without CDA pre-approval, you would have to rebid the project, else the CDBG funding would be rescinded. Tips regarding environmental review. If available, please attach any environmental reports, particularly any that include sampling specimens, since we don't do that on site or in-house. Regulations require that CDA must automatically rescind CDBG funding if any construction work or closing on a site acquisition occurs without a notice to proceed issued by CDA. Doing these types of activities without CDA consent is what HUD calls a choice limiting action, which is unallowable per CDBG regulations. This is an important note on multiple funding sources. This is applicable for any activity awarded with CDBG funding, but it is especially crucial for construction projects. The general rule of thumb is that entities must follow the most stringent set of rules. Out of all funding sources that an agency may use for an activity, CDBG is usually the most stringent. In this way, CDBG funding, quote unquote, taints other funding sources because other funding sources may have to adhere to other CDBG specific regulatory requirements, such as procurement procedures, environmental review, Section 3, Davis-Bacon, and so on and so forth. You cannot, for instance, use corporate contributions to start pouring the foundation without CDA approval because you figured that cost wasn't paid for with CDBG or federal funds. All money, federal and non-federal, CDBG and non-CDBG, cannot be used to even dig a hole in the ground until CDA approval is acquired. The proposed the proposed activity budget narratives pertain to all applicants, not just construction. In this section, you will disclose your other funding sources. You should always be seeking to leverage CDBG funding, as CDBG funding is not meant to be your sole source. Show us how the CDBG funds will be leveraged. In the narrative, explain which leveraged funds are anticipated and/or secured. Be realistic in your budget projections and include in your budget your leveraged sources. Here are some additional tips as it relates to the activity budget. In egrams, balancing the activity budget is one of the most common validation errors received by users. Two ways to eliminate errors are to ensure that the activity budget is greater than or equal to the proposed CDBG amount, and that the total expenses should not be more than the total revenue. Your budget should not reflect that you are in the red. At the same time, as nonprofits, you should not have a surplus. Here are some tips regarding particular line items. Note that local travel per city policy is currently being reimbursed at 59.5% per mile, or 59.5 cents per mile, which is subject to change. Contract services and other line items requiring procurement will require CDA approval if costs exceed $10,000 or more per vendor. This amount has increased from the previous $2,000 threshold. Also note that personnel costs will require additional forms and EEO approval if the position is paid for in whole or in part with CDBG funding. Common mistakes are not including leveraged funds into the activity budget if they were declared in the budget narrative. Not providing a description of each of your line items. Descriptions help raters determine cost reasonableness of your line items and determine if your costs reasonably match your activity. Not providing descriptions may hurt your rating. Another mistake is including contractual workers under personnel costs instead of professional services. As mentioned earlier, information from your personnel description and resumes will automatically populate into your full or part-time personnel schedule. The schedule forms will add the part and full-time salary totals as well as the FICA taxes. Note that the percent of eligible benefits must be less than or equal to the percent of salary charged to the grant. The totals from your personnel schedules will carry over into the activity budget page. Note that egrams will indicate an error if the personnel costs exceed the proposed grant amount. Here are some tips regarding completing the full-time personnel schedule. Actual salaries per pay period should be actual salaries per pay period. Number of pay periods should be the number of pay periods within the entire year. Ensure that the percent of time charged to the activity from the organizational narrative section is correct. The actual salaries and the number of pay periods must be accurate and will be verified by CDA should you be funded. However, the percent charged to the program can be minimally changed by using GoalSeek in Microsoft Excel to make your numbers work as long as the percent charged is still a reasonable estimate. Common mistakes are not including the total pay periods for the year. If you get paid bi-weekly, there would be 26 pay periods. Bi-monthly, 24 pay periods, and monthly, 12 pay periods. Not inserting the total amount paid for each pay period is another common mistake. Excuse me. Here's an example. Here's an example of the top portion of a full-time personnel schedule. It indicates the staff's name and title, their actual salary per pay period, the percent charged to Cdbg, and the total amount charged to Cdbg by multiplying the actual salary times the percent charged times the number of pay periods. Because staff from the personnel description carries over to the personnel schedules, you may also have staff like Lisa May, who helps administer the program, but her salary is not being charged to the grant. Here is the bottom section of the full-time personnel schedule. Note that the benefits must be equal to or less than the salary rate charged to Cdbg. I spoke about making minute changes to the percent charged to balance out the personnel schedule within reason. You could also make adjustments to the percent of benefits charged to make your numbers work as well. Here are some tips regarding completing the part-time personnel schedule. Similar to the full-time personnel schedule, the hourly rate and the total hours for the entire year should be accurate. Ensure the percent of time charged to the Cdbg activity is a solid estimate, which may require using Excel's GoalSeek feature. Common mistakes are identical to a full-time personnel schedule, which is not inserting actual annual hours worked. Here is an example of the part-time personnel schedule. It indicates the staff's name and title, their hourly rate, and total annual hours that will be worked. their actual annual salary, percent charged to CDBG, and the total amount charged to CDBG by multiplying their annual salary by the percent charged to the CDBG activity. This is an important tip to belabor because we see this issue frequently. Only include employees on the personnel schedule. Contractors and consultants should go under the professional service line in your activity budget. This is because all professional services, once they exceed $10,000 per vendor, require CDA approval of your procurement procedures and the contract you have with them. If a non-construction activity, your proposed reimbursement analysis will most likely be based upon a per unit analysis. Previously, we discussed per unit costs being tied to reimbursement. You should have no more than 1 unit of service per outcome or objective. Tips are making sure your units are clear and well-defined by including any assumptions or calculations. Examples of units of service are the following: number of meals delivered to seniors, number of completed workshops for first-time homebuyers, daily attendance in an after-school program, number of community gardens planted. Factors to consider when arriving at your per unit costs include the following: the lifespan of a contract. All non-construction projects would be for a year. The frequency of the reimbursements. There should be a reasonable amount of work associated with each unit. For example, the number of meals provided would likely have more units of service than number of workshops completed for first-time homebuyers, for example. The amount of your request or award. Ideally, if funded, your request will match your awarded amount, but due to many factors, your award amount could be less than anticipated, which would impact, among many other things, your per unit analysis. It is also based upon reasonable assumptions and Cdbg eligible program expenses. The last factor is units of service that must be related to the outputs based either on persons or households, but they do not have to be the same. For example, an after-school program would serve persons, which would be their output, but the per unit analysis would be based upon daily attendance. For the sake of time, I suggest that you review these examples of per unit cost when you have a moment. Note that these are examples that have been proven successful in the past and can serve as guides, but not as limits in your organization determining a reasonable per unit cost. There is no cookie cutter approach. I would like to conclude with common Egrants mistakes. All of these errors are identified in the Egrants presentation, and so I will not go over each mistake for the sake of time. Instead, I will redirect you to the Egrants slide that the administrator has created for users, as well as the Egrants walkthrough tutorial that is posted online. So I recall someone had questions about how to log in and how to create a user profile. So I would definitely recommend going, clicking on this. I can't click on it. My hyperlink isn't working. And then this is basically stating that in the video, I talk about how to acquire these slides that the administrator created. And it's kind of a convoluted way to get them. So I also included those slides here. So this concludes the best practices RFP presentation. Are there any questions? So it looks like there are some questions. The first question is, where is the rating sheet in the eGrams menu navigation? Sorry, not finding it. So when you log in, I believe it's at the point where you start to actually enter your proposal. On the top right-hand side, there is a hyperlink called Show Documents. If you click on that, that is where you will see the rating sheet. And if that, I'm much more of a visual person. If that is not particularly helpful, my description, those definitely look at the eGrams video. I do talk about where the rating sheet and other items are located. Where can I find the latest, I believe, I believe this person's trying to say NARSA zip codes. So we don't have we know NARSA is based upon neighborhoods. And so you would have to determine those neighborhoods, and then you could probably Google those neighborhoods to find the zip codes for each of those neighborhoods. I hope that makes sense. Another question is, when including administrative staff on a program request, should we also include partial salary of the Chief Development Officer? So yes, on the personnel description, you need to include everyone that is administering or touching this proposed program. So even if that person, and I guess this person, in this case, they're saying this person's being partially paid. So yes, that person would be included in the description, which would auto-populate into the personnel schedule as well. And I will wait a moment to see if there are any additional questions. Okay, I am not seeing any additional questions. So that concludes our presentation. Best of luck in the RFP. Take care.